It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are going to address some of the big business news that we have been treated to all week long. We've got a lot to unpack. But before we get into all that, I have 2 points of business to discuss. The first one is that MMA FA is tweeting out the UFC class action long form notifications, and they're doing it in several different languages, so all the fighters on the roster will have all the pertinent details to get ready for the next steps in this antitrust case en route to collecting their money. So that's MMA FA, the MMA Fighters Association. So their handle on Twitter, X if you will, is MMA FA. Now, my second order of business today is a question that we got over on Blue Sky for John. Now, this comes from Pricesters, aka PJ on Blue Sky, and his handle is at ptros.bsky.social. Now, his question is, since Trump loves to mess over workers, what do you think the chances are that Trump interferes in the Lee case to do his TKO buddies a solid, which would then stiff the fighters?
Well, I guess we might have some questions about the partisanship of the question that was asked, but the thing is that was a concern for the election. We talked about it several times in our previous episodes, more about the Johnson case, because there's more opportunities for the Trump administration to interject into the Johnson case. There's very little that the Trump administration could do to interject themselves into the Lee case. That case has been settled by both parties. And so they would have to, the UFC, the Endeavor, the owners of the UFC that have agreed to the settlement would have to step away from it, which would infuriate the judges, and even right-wing conservative courts would probably not side with them after that. That would be you're violating the terms of the agreement you came to. So the UFC wants this case settled. They want it done. They want it out of their hair. And so there's very little that they can do at this point if the judge grants the settlement, because they've agreed to it and they're ready to sign off on it. So that's done. Now, if for some reason that the court doesn't grant the settlement, not the UFC backs out of it, but the court itself decides that we can't agree to the settlement because we have other parties that have said that they don't like the settlement, or there's conditions of it that the judge decides he doesn't like about it. Well, then if it starts going to trial, it does become a problem where the Trump administration could do something, namely his Department of Justice, or FTC, who oversee antitrust. They could write an amicus brief. Let's say it goes to trial and the UFC loses in trial and they want to appeal it. They could write an amicus brief in response to get to get a greater opportunity, greater chance that one of the upper courts would look over the case and review it. So they could do something like that. There's also the possibility that they could write a brief in support of the UFC if they wanted to take it to another judge and said the judge overstepped his bounds by not agreeing to the settlement that he agreed to. So then he could do something, but as my second example showed, it wouldn't be him screwing over the fighters per se. It'd be him and helping his administration help him to enforce the settlement they agreed to. So for the Johnson case, there's very little concern about what the Trump administration means for the future of this case. The Johnson case is the one they're a little concerned about, because not that it's a death knell to it, but where it makes it more difficult is, again, like I said, you have an administration that their agencies might be more friendly to the UFC, might write amicus briefs in their support. That's beneficial to them. Also can appoint more judges that are conservative bent, especially Federalist Society judges. These are the type that they appoint in Texas that seem to rule against workers all the time. That's more risky for the fighters going forward. And finally, Trump seems to have the ability to leverage his support to even influence courts at times. And so there's that opportunity as well. So it does get, the Johnson case will be at greater risk because of the Trump administration. But the Lee case, I think, it's pretty safe to say it is safe as long as there's nothing wild that comes out of left field.
All right. So we're now going to get into the beef, the meat and potatoes of the episode. And that's all this big news that has come out. And at the top of the list is the UFC's broadcast rights deal, which they'll now be in negotiations with several prospective dance partners because it's the first of the year. And they're right. It's supposed to happen like within this month, right? They're, totally free and legal to go into their negotiations, correct?
Well, I think they're in an exclusive negotiating period for the first quarter this year, or is it first 6 weeks? I can't remember the exact amount of time. They have exclusive. They can only negotiate with ESPN at first. After that period is done, then they're free to negotiate with anybody. So it depends. Are they going to, we might get an announcement that they've renewed with ESPN and we have an agreement in place and they're not going to negotiate with anybody else. That seems unlikely considering the suitors and what we've heard. But after sometime in a month or two from now, we will hear news that the UFC is starting to negotiate with other entities besides ESPN.
So what we're hearing is that the asking price is supposedly $1 billion per year. What were the numbers on the current deal so we can compare?
Well, currently we don't have exact numbers, but we have some very good estimates from various sources. Generally, for the current deal, they are on basically the average per year is supposed to be around, probably a little less than, but around $300 million per year for just the ESPN Plus deal, both the streaming and cable package. So for that deal, it's around $300 million a year, which gives you all the fight nights, all the Ultimate Fighters, and all the pay-per-view prelim cards. You get all that for that deal. I believe is actually a little less than $300 million on average, annualized average, or it might be peaking at slightly over $300 million now. Now for the pay-per-views, a separate deal, they got, I believe it's at about $200 million per year on average. Right now, it started, I think, I can't remember if it's 11 or 13 million the first year per pay-per-view they're paid, and now they're up to 20 million per pay-per-view. So they started somewhere around 140 million per year for all the pay-per-views, and now they're up to about 240 million, maybe 250 for the entire year's worth of pay-per-view for ESPN to have exclusive rights to that. So together, you add that together, and the annualized average for the average amount that they got per year for those deals is close to anywhere from 450 million to 500 million. Now, it should be noted, when they first went into negotiations for just the broadcast and ESPN deal, just the ESPN and streaming service and their cable broadcast deal, that the UFC was looking for 450 million and ended up only getting 300 million. So they had projected to get a much better deal than they did. But in the end, they still ended up making a lot of money on the deal.
Is that $1 billion per year out of the realm of possibility, seeing as how it's so much more than the last deal? Or do you think it could be an actual achievable outcome?
It seems, as ludicrous as it sounds, it is plausible. It is possible that they could get that amount. That is right now, that's their bullish figure they're looking for. The maximum they're looking at is 2x what they're getting. That'd be a little more than 2x, so they'd be doing even better than that. But it is possible they get that much. But at the very least, let's say they've over projected again and they don't get that much. At the very least, they're going to get several hundred million more, than what they're getting now. Don Davis predicted a 10-year deal for $800 million a year. So that'd be about a $300 million per year increase, a 60% increase over what they have right now, not a 100% increase, which would be, they want the 100% increase, but 60% may be possible. The other thing to think about is that they might be doing kind of like what they did with WWE, selling global rights at the same time. There's Rob Joyner pointed out that their Brazil deal has come to an end and they're putting that on Fight Pass. They are not negotiating a new Brazil deal. Brazil's huge in Netflix. For Netflix, Brazil's a big territory for them. So several international territories, they might be bundling together with the U.S. and get a better deal a much bigger deal than it would be if it's just the U.S. only broadcast deal. So it is possible that, I don't think it's unrealistic that we might hit $1 billion. I do think, though, it will not be just the U.S. market. If they do that, they will get a streaming service to pay for. It'll be a global deal from either, they'll probably split the deal in half, as we talked about, with Netflix getting some, or Amazon getting some of the package, and maybe ESPN renewing some of the package. But it'll be split up to maximize the return, but the total amount might end up being $1 billion. And that does not seem inconceivable considering the options they have.
I have a side question here, and this is going to be strictly opinion from you, but what is the magic potion that they're using to lure in $1 billion per year? I mean, what is setting them apart when we know we're getting watered down cards? We know that there's not much to draw in a casual viewer. As far as the talent goes, they're not really out there trying to build stars. So what's the magic potion? What's the secret sauce?
Well, it's because they have concentrated the MMA market, and they're not looking for wider, broader appeal. They've kind of reached that point, especially in the United States, where they've reached the point where they've reached is probably the maximum amount of U.S. fans that they're going to make. Maybe it can grow a little bit, but this is, peak U.S. fandom, right? The size they have. So what they're offering is, they have a paying fan base. We can put the content on a subscription-based platform. The fans will pay. They will then pay an additional amount to see the good fights on pay-per-view. And so I do think it's likely whoever buys it, maybe they don't do a typical pay-per-view offer where you have to pay individual fights. Maybe you have to pay a special subscription. Or, maybe we luck out. I don't think it's possible, but maybe we luck out and Netflix pays just a flat fee and puts on the regular Netflix like they did with the Paul versus Tyson. I think that's unlikely, though, because the fan base is willing to pay so much. So that's what you're paying for. You're paying for, they have several million fans that will subscribe to, I shouldn't say several million, but over 1 million, maybe 2 million fans that will pay for ESPN Plus. That's a bonus. Now, the ESPN Plus content can be garbage, which is even better for the UFC because and the network, because people are still paying for it. And the degenerate gamblers, as we've talked about, will tune into every fight night. And then when they want to put a big event on, more of them will pay an extra amount for the pay-per-views. And then the broadcaster can recoup some of the money through that. So I guess the secret sauce is the UFC, unlike boxing where it's splintered. And so you have multiple choices where you want to watch it. And so you're maybe a little more judicial with your spending habits. MMA, it's all concentrated with the UFC. The fan base is all there. They're all willing to pay a subscription fee. They're all willing to then pay for the pay-per-views. And so that's your answer. You can generate a lot of money. And on top of that, you don't have, if streamers and networks now are dependent on to get live audiences, they need to get sports, things that people will watch live. Sports is one of the few things people watch live. You can run advertising during it. And so they're willing to pay a premium for that. And all the other major sports properties have signed contracts in place. And so the only one that's coming up, if you want to get into sports or get additional sports product, the only one you can get right now that's available is UFC. And so there'll be a bidding process that's going to drive the rate up even higher.
Do other other sports, particularly the stick and ball sports, do they get deals like this, broadcast rights deals this big, or are they bigger, smaller? Just curious. I was just going to say right away, much bigger. Okay.
Much bigger when you add up the total. I mean, even hockey and stuff is a bigger deal than, I guess, I don't know what the current hockey NHL is getting in the United States. But when you add the Canadian, they have a separate Canadian deal. It's going to, when you add them together, it's definitely the eclipse with the UFC does. But of course, they offer often more content. But on top of this, pro sports have, besides just the network deals that pay them a lot, things like the NHL and Major League Baseball, they have the regional broadcasters that collect more money as well.
Okay. Next question: do we have any idea what a new deal would mean for the fighters?
Well, we do a little bit because about a year and a half ago, Morgan Stanley they released a paper on this, a projection, a paper. I don't know what I should call it exactly, but it was an analysis of what's going on with the UFC, and they broke down what the possibilities for the expectations for the next TV deal was, and 1.5, 50% higher than what they have now would have been their bearish model. And then 175% would be their average. And then their 200% would have been, the very optimistic, the bullish, optimistic projection. And so, but what they also noted is that 85% of the additional revenue going to be generated by this new deal that they get would go to earnings, would basically be profit. And the reason to be profit is because their expenses would only take up 15% of the additional revenue. And you can interpret, as you look at that, it's pretty obvious what they mean by expenses is fighter expenses. So they project that fighters likely, doesn't mean they're guaranteed, but they estimated fighters would get 15% of the additional revenue, and the UFC would get 85% in additional basically profits at that point, because all the other expenses are fixed. When you sign a new TV deal, your cameraman doesn't get paid more. Your production costs don't go up, right? The only thing that's a variable is fighter costs and the deal itself and your profit level. And so if they do twice as much on the next deal, double the revenue on the next deal, and it goes from 500 million to $1 billion, that's 500 million additional money. That means that the UFC is going to get 425 million, basically an additional, just go right to profit. And the fighters under that projection would get an additional 75 million in pay.
But still not what they're worth.
Well, I mean, it depends. If you think they're the primary draw, then you would think they would get the majority of that revenue.
Right.
If you think fans are tuning in because they want to watch John Jones versus whoever, if he fights Tom Aspinall or Alex Pereira, if you think they're tuning in to see O'Malley or Merab, whoever you think they're fighting, you think they're tuning in to see the fighters, then I think the fighters deserve a much larger percentage of this additional revenue that they've added to the UFC. If you think fans don't care at all who's fighting and are just there to listen to Joe Rogan and watch Dana White, then the UFC deserves the majority of money. But I think, personally, based on what events we talk about, what events draw, I think it's pretty obvious that the fighters, the best fighters, are what draws interest. And because the UFC has all the best fighters, they can use that as leverage to get even more money. So I would like to see the fighters get a much bigger chunk of that, but that's not the way it works.
Other big news is that TKO, and that's the parent company of UFC and WWE, that they'll be partnering with the Saudis to make an official foray into boxing. Now, if true, is this TKO basically locking down all of combat sports, all the big ones anyway?
It kind of is. It does seem to be their plan. There was talk years ago that the Fertittas had pitched this to Dana White, or Dana White pitched it. I can't remember, one or the other. Someone in the Zuffa. The Zuffa pitch was that we could basically take over combat sports. At the time, I think they meant boxing and MMA, and maybe kickboxing at the time, because K1 was big back in the day. But it does look like that discussion well over a decade ago might be coming to fruition now, because TKO, as you said, is working with, at least according to the New York Times, has some plans in place with the Saudis. What should be noted is this is not very shocking. We've discussed basically everything in the New York Times story is stuff we've discussed with others. It's not like we're the only ones, but you could read in the tea leaves that TKO, if they were going to get into boxing the way they've suggested, it does sound like they would want to work with the Saudis and pay a lot of money and pay a management fee to them. All the stuff that we discussed previously. And so none of that's really that surprising.
What would that partnership look like in practice, though?
Well, again, we're going to have to take a guess because we have some details from the New York Times article, but we don't have full details. One is that a big partner would be the Saudis. It sounds like what they're really doing is kind of like what Endeavor did with WWE and UFC, is where they would offer their management team would come and run the company. Now, Endeavor owned the majority of stock shares of WWE when they did this and of UFC. So it was, much more incestuous relationship. Here it sounds like the Saudis would own the majority. But the TKO team would act as the management for it, the way the Endeavor did. As CEO is negotiating deals, I imagine, negotiating broadcast deals, site fees, locations, doing the production, all the stuff that they handle, that they have tons of experience now with their staff with WWE and UFC. They would do that, and they would collect a management fee and shares in the company. And the management fee is, I think, $33 million. It was reported as, at least New York Times projected as, which is $33 million of free money just to oversee the project. So I think that's how it would work. There's some other details that they're going to build fighters up from the bottom up as part of the deal, and which goes hand in hand with the something we reported a while ago that we'd heard, is that the when Top Rank possibly will leave ESPN, that would be replaced by kind of a UFC, a Dana White contender show, but for boxers. So I think that's likely. And so I think their plan is that the Endeavor would run the operation on behalf of the Saudis. The Saudis would be the true owners, though, and the UFC would be trying to build up and sign young fighters because they're more affordable. Why they also look to, I'm imagining, find some way to take control of the sanctioning organizations. And so when they're young, cheaper fighters locked into contract, move up and eventually start taking over the top spots, they're locked into the contracts they have and can't leave. That's my guess what would look like. So it'd be kind of like a long play to create a kind of a UFC of boxing that way.
2 questions on that. The first question is, do you think that this partnership is so that more boxing gets held in Saudi Arabia, or they don't care at this point? And then my other question is, what do you think all the other boxing promoters are thinking of this? Bob Arum, Eddie Hearn, Frank Warren, even De La Hoya. Those are my 2 questions for you. To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Okay, the face!